Well, amen. Good morning and welcome to the Well. If you haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Danny. I'm the pastor here at our church and just want to add my welcome on top of the ones you've already received. It's just so good to see you in worship. And if you've never been here before, or maybe you've just never noticed, the space does look a little bit different today. And I would say that coming in here, there's a level of excitement and energy just through seeing this space, through worship, and it's been really fun. Even if they're little micro changes, it's been fun to make this space feel a little bit more like our home and our own as we continue to claim it and live into what God is doing here at the Well. But as Sue said, we're in a series right now called Unwind, where we're talking about how we live these unwound lives, right? Like we have this desire to be free from burdens, from schedules. We have this desire to live into what Jesus tells us is this abundant life, whether we know anything about the story of Jesus or read the Bible before. I think we want an abundant life. We may not name it that way, but we want that kind of life, right? Something that feels fulfilling and feels full. But it's a hard thing to embrace, right? And over the last couple of weeks, we've spent time talking about some of the things that get in the way of that, like finding stillness, finding rest, being able to embrace those sorts of things. But I was thinking about it, maybe this is just personally to me, but I have a hard time living in the liminal space between being wound up and unwound, right? Like between knowing where I was and what could be. And my best analogy for this is I live and die by my Google Calendar. If it's not in there, it doesn't exist to me. And that means I've missed coffees with some of you, and I really do apologize for that. But that's a clerical error on my fault, not putting that in there. But I live by my calendar, right? And so I don't know if you do this. Like if I have a 9 a.m. and then a noon, I'll go to my 9 a.m., I'll say I'm done by 10. I feel like that time between, I have no idea what to do with it. It feels like dead, wasted time because all I can do is I don't have enough time to start a new project. I don't have enough time to go open up a new thing. And I'm just waiting then for an hour. And sometimes it's not an hour, it's 3 hours later. And then I waste several hours just waiting for this next thing to come. And I don't know if you're anything like that, but there is this feeling that we have sometimes in the in-between space of knowing that we have the thing that's in front of us, but we're so fixated on what's next, or maybe we're still living in what's behind us, that we forget that we're actually kind of free in the middle, and we miss this freedom, we miss this opportunity we have. And so that's kind of what I want to explore for us today, right? It's I think many of us, as we attempt to live these lives that are not wound up, that embrace the freedom that Jesus has for us, that helps us shed away busyness and shed away distraction and embrace kind of a spirituality that's life-giving. My suspicion is many of us are closer than we think to that space. We might actually be living in the midst of it. But one of two things could be distracting us from it is looking back at where we were, or rather looking forward at what's coming next, and we miss the opportunity of living and embracing the moment exactly where we are. And so to do that, as Sue said, we're going to be looking at a story that may be familiar to some of you. It comes out of the Gospel of Luke, and it's the story of the prodigal son. And the story follows this father. He has these two sons, one of which runs away and lives life wildly, and comes back, embraced by the father, kind of lives this new sort of life. And the other one stays home, and he witnesses what his brother does, and he's a little bit frustrated, but we'll get to his story in a little bit. But they respond very differently to life in the moment, life in the past, and what life can look like in the future. And I think they have something really, really interesting to tell us as we attempt to dive into these kind of unwound lives of our own. And so if you have your Bible with you, or if you want to just follow on the screen, we're going to be in the Gospel of Luke. We're going to be in the 14th chapter, and we're going to, that's a lie, we're going to be in the 15th chapter. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke. We're going to be looking at the story of the prodigal son. So Jared will throw it up for us. And the story, it follows this son again that makes a decision to kind of depart away from his father and to go and to live his own life. And so it says, Jesus said, a certain man had two sons. A younger son said to his father, "Father, I must give you my share of the inheritance." And then his father divided the estate between them. Soon afterwards, the younger son gathered everything together, and he took a trip to a faraway land. And so stopping there just for a second, right? one thing in culture that we don't talk about, like in comparison to like current American culture to like what would have been biblical times, is we don't always like look at just what are all of the relational dynamics that would have happened here. So for this son to ask his father for his inheritance, which was rightfully his and something that he deserved and something that he would get, he is telling his father in this moment, like, you are not just like relationally dead to me, but I'm going to live as if you are fully physically, emotionally, and spiritually dead to me. Like, this is an act of high disrespect at every level and an act of selfishness at every single level. And so he goes to his father. He says, like, essentially everything you've done for me up to this point is null and void. I don't need it anymore. You are dead to me. I am dead to you. Give me what's mine so I can go live life the way I want to live it. And so it says that he sets off on a trip to a faraway land. There he wastes his wealth through extravagant living, where when he had used up his resources, a severe food famine or a severe food shortage arose in the country, and he began to be in need. And so the story continues as you see that he's in need, right? Like, he's there, he goes, and he does everything that he wants to do, right? Like, he lives life to the fullest, lives life in every way that he wants, and he runs out of resources. Famine strikes, he's in need. And he says that he hires himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to work in the field with the pigs. Again, culturally, this kind of work would have been the most demoralizing and degrading. Like, for him to go from the station in life that he was in to now where he's at, this is the ultimate, like, we talk about comeback stories and turnaround stories. This is the ultimate fall from glory and the fall from grace. Like, you couldn't get much worse than this. Like, he has money, he has prestige, he has a life and a family that loves him, he gets everything he thinks he ever wants, and now he winds up working in a field, working with the pigs, something that religiously would have been seen as very holy or unholy and unclean to them, so there's some level of even disrespect and shame that's happening there. It said no one gave him anything, and when he came to his senses, he said, how many more of my father's hired hands have more than enough food, but I'm here starving to death? He says, I'll get up and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven, and I've sinned against you. Now, I am both a father, but I have been a son before. And I've messed up before in my life, and I know that moment, right? Like, I'm going to get up, and I'm going to go to my parents. And, like, if you've ever been in that situation, right? You're in your room, and you're, like, pacing back and forth, like, God, I've sinned against, Father, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you. Like, going back, and you're, like, rehearsing your apology speech. Like, when my son gets upset, and we have to, like, have that conversation, he goes to his room, and when he finally calms down, I can witness him, like, he doesn't know I'm watching him, but I can, like, see him, like, he's getting his game face on, right? Like, and that's what he's doing in this thing. He's, like, getting his game face on. He's rehearsing his speech. He wants to say it right so that he is able to navigate and manage this situation. He's like, I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And so he heads back, and he says, make me one of your hired hands. So again, he doesn't even ask for his old station back. He's like, just like bring me, like you'll treat me better as a worker and a slave here than I am working for these pigs in a foreign, at least I know people here, right? Like at least I know this community. It may not be any better, but at least I know it. And he says he gets up and he goes to his father, but it says while he's still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, he hugged him, and he kissed him. He said this, Father, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you. I'm no longer to be worthy to be called your son. He's doing the thing he's rehearsed, right? And his father, he interrupts him, and he says, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. And the story is interesting because he has been, like this younger son, right? He had everything he wanted in his current lived experience, like before he ever leaves, right? He has everything. He has money, he has security, he has family, he has prestige, but he's so wound up in all of it that he misses how beautiful that is, right? And we've been in that situation before, right? We're like, we have like really, hindsight's always 20/20, right? We look back and we're like, man, that was actually pretty great, right? Like I had wonderful people around me, I had a great job. If you've ever switched jobs before, like hopefully the new job becomes wonderful. But usually in the first 6 months, you're like, this was the wrong choice, right? And that's kind of what he's doing here, right? Like he realizes that he made a terrible decision. He realizes that it's not going the way he wanted, and he says, I'm gonna go back home. But he was so bound up that he doesn't realize how wonderful it is, right? But then he gets stuck in the in-between, and that's what I want us to explore, right? He's stuck in the in-between of wondering, like, do I have to still live bound up, right? Like I had it all, I missed it the first time, and now my only entry back into this, my only way to return and to recover is to bind myself back up by my shame and the things that I've done and measure myself against everyone else. But the father in this story is just wildly compassionate and extravagant. And this is, again, like an important part of a story that I think we can easily miss is the response of the father in this story, who is representative of God, right? So this story is not a literal story that we're reading, like Jesus is telling it to push a point. And so we're, the younger son represents like us, like we're turning away from God and going our own direction. The father represents God in this story. And what do we see that God does? Well, God doesn't like sit back and like kind of hang out on the porch and just legs crossed like, well, someday my son will come home and someday, he'll figure it out. And when he does, like, I'm going to just stare at him until he starts bawling with shame. Like, he doesn't do that, right? Like, what does he do? It says he gets up, and while his son is still a long way off, he sprints to him, right? He runs to him. He closes the gap. Well, there is this room that this son feels like he has to do all of the work to close. The father in this story says, I'm going to do the work of closing the gap. I'm going to pursue you. I'm going to come after you. I'm going to meet you in the midst of all of the stuff that you feel like is separating us from each other, all the shame and the guilt and all the stuff that's now binding you up worse than you were ever bound up before. I'm going to close that gap, and I'm going to meet you there with love and with grace and compassion. And then they throw this huge, extravagant, wonderful party, right? All of the best things, right? And I've had a few parties in my life, never after like making terrible decisions. So I can't imagine what that's like. But even when I was like a birthday party or something, I don't think I got all the best things, right? Like he's made every terrible decision, and every best thing, the best sandals on his feet, the best robe to be dressed in, the best calf to be eaten for his friends, right? Everything is the best of the best of the best for this son that wasn't just dead to his father, but he told his father that he was dead to him, right? He did the most egregious act he could have done to his father, and he still receives the best of the best of the best as he comes into that. And I think for many of us, like if we're putting ourselves in the character shoes of anyone in this story, and again, there's another character we'll dive into in a second on the other side of this, but I think many of us resonate with this younger prodigal son. Whether it's because we feel like we lived a life that pushed us really far away from God, or we just feel like we've lived like a marginally okay life and we just don't have access back to what God has for us, the promise in the story. Like there are degrees of what that looks like, but I think many of us resonate with that feeling of being whatever our distant, far off land looks like, doing all the things that we thought were going to make us happy, and we're sitting there in the pit of whatever that shame looks like, eating with the pigs, doing the lowest of the low, and we have no vision of what a life could look like outside of that. And the promise of this story that I think begins to unwind us is like we don't do the work of unwinding, right? Like God is running towards us. Like the father in the story is running towards his son, and I think we often put the work of unwinding on ourselves, right? To be able like I'm going to be more free, and I'm going to be less busy. But the father in this story and our God in our lives is the one running full force towards us, like unwinding it for us. But what I think we often do, like as we see it unwound, we're like, we got to put all these pieces back together. Like we feel like we're putting a puzzle together. We're like yarning, putting all the yarn together more tangled than it was before. And the challenge for us, I think, is as we sit in the space of maybe this younger son, the challenge is like, how do we allow God to run towards us? How do we allow God to do the work of unwinding? Like, yes, over the course of the weeks, we need to find rest. Like, that's foundational. Like, we can't have an unwound life if we're always trying to be busy and go to the next thing. We can't live an unwound life if we're always seeking busyness over stillness. Like, we can't live an unwound life if our only desires in life are to climb the ladder and fill and do more. And all of those things are important. But just like the son in this story, as we return home to whatever that looks like for us, there actually is a surrender to allow God to begin to do the greatest work of unwinding that has to be done. Like, we can only do so much of it on our own to unwind it, because there's so much of our stories that we don't even know, I think, fully ourselves, right? Like, we have things that are like emotional and spiritual landmines that we step on, and we're like, oh, I didn't even know that existed. Like, that was a terrible feeling, right? And God is the one that I think allows us to begin to unwind and unfold those. But what's interesting in this story is that there's another brother. And when I was reading for this, up until like Wednesday of this week, I had no interest in continuing the story. I was like, we looked at the only brother that matters, right? Like, we looked at the one that was the most important, and I was like reading it, I think, Thursday night, and I was like, well, crap. Like, we can't not talk about this guy. Like, I just said we're all this other brother, we might actually all be this other guy, right? So the story continues. So if you've never read it before, there's a really super cool brother that's hanging out at home while his younger brother's doing some other stuff. And the story continues. It says his older brother was in the field. And so this is all happening. The younger brother's coming back. It's just like, like the party's happening in the other room, right? There's all this exciting stuff happening. And he comes in, and it says he's in the field. Coming in from the field, he approached the house, and he heard music and dancing. And he called out to one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he received his son back safe and sound. And this is like the important part, right? Like here, it says the older son was furious, and he didn't want to enter the house. But his father came out to him, he begged him, and he answered his father. So the story continues on in the next verses and says this. It says, look, I've served you all of these years. This is the older brother talking. I've served you all of these years. I've never once disobeyed your instructions. And you've never given me as much as a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. Now, I felt slighted. I'm a twin. I felt slighted, and I've never said that line to my parents before. Like, Mom, when am I getting a young goat? I've never said that before. So shows there's some cultural differences for us, right? But you get it, right? Like, I've never got even the littlest of things, right? Like, you didn't give me anything. I've been here, and you haven't given me anything to celebrate with my friends. I've done the right thing my entire life. But when this son of yours returned, after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him. And then the story ends with the father and the son having one final interaction. It says, son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and now is found. There is a different type of being wound up that we don't talk about enough, which is the being wound up of comparison of other people working through their unwinding. Like, we sit there and we look at our own lives and we say, well, I've been here the entire time and I haven't got a party. I haven't got even a young goat, right? Like, I haven't got any of these things. And we're over here, like, and we're a church that wants to be radically inclusive, right? We want to be a church that your seat at the table can't cost anyone else their seat at the table. Like, we say all the time, we've saved you a seat. But one of the biggest challenges in a church that wants to live into that mindset, and individuals that want to live into that mindset, is that there's always one more seat that needs to be added, right? Like, the level of grace and inclusion in the story of God and us didn't stop when we found our seat, right? The inclusion didn't stop when we finally felt welcome, right? The story of grace and God didn't end when our unwinding finally ceased, right? Like, the story is always inviting and always continuing and always expanding. And so one brother, this younger brother, like, he's bound up in his pursuit of finding happiness, right? Like, he wants to find wild living. He wants to go to a new place. Like, I resonate with him. Like, I'd move every 3 years if I could. I would be financially irresponsible every day of my life given the choice to do that, right? Like, I would do a lot of wild things given just like the ability to do whatever I want, right? So I resonate with him in that way. But I have also, as a brother, as a twin brother, as a follower of Jesus, as a spouse, as a parent, I've sat there and I've watched grace extended and felt slighted to me. It had nothing to do with me, but I felt like I lost something because someone else got something. And maybe you felt that before, right? Like sometimes people talk about like equality isn't a pie. Like just because someone else gets a slice doesn't mean like you get any less of it, right? Like, but that's how we feel, right? Like when someone else gets a little piece of the puzzle, a little piece of the pie, when someone else gets a seat, sometimes our natural reaction, and I think this is because of being wound up, is to say, does that mean there's less for me? Does that mean that I don't get to embrace this, right? And with the promise that God and the Father in the story tells his other son is like, you've had access to all of that. Like you've had the best sandals, the best robe, the best calf, all of this you had access to, which is interesting, like to think about. He was so tied up that he missed his opportunity to do all of the things this younger brother was doing, which tells us that he didn't have to have this terrible turn in his life to be saved and redeemed to embrace this. All he had to do was like push all of the other stuff to the side to see that he could embrace and live into the life that God has for him in that moment. And so I don't know exactly like which one you fall in, or maybe none of them, but if you resonate with one, I think there's different challenges for each side of this, right? Like if we resonate with the younger, wild living brother, I think our challenge in this is to figure out like, how do we believe that God's grace is actually doing the work of unwinding us, like running after us, and there's actually unapologetically and wholeheartedly nothing we could do to ever lose that. Like there isn't a step too far to one direction or anything we could do to lose that love and that grace that God has for us. Like maybe you're in that seat. Like that's an important truth to remember. Like we come to church and we sing songs and we dive into stories and we participate in small groups. But I bet many of us lay in bed at night and we wonder, how secure in God's love am I really? Like how much does God really love me? Did I do too many wrong things today? And the promise of this story is like, God's running after you. God's in front of you. God's pursuing you. But our challenge is to believe that's actually happening, right? And then maybe we're on the other brother's side, right? And the challenge in that is to say, like, do we actually believe that God's grace was so radically inclusive and profound that it didn't stop with us? Like, I'm a pretty messed up dude, so it took God a lot of grace to include me. But I have to believe God's grace is so far more expansive than my story, right? And the story wouldn't be as beautiful as it could be if it stopped with me. And I think many of us, once we become on the inside, the challenge is to remember what life was like on the outside so that we're continuing unwinding our lives and inviting others to live that sort of life as well. And so my challenge, I guess, for me or for you would be like wherever you sit across this, whether you're the younger brother, the older brother, to ask yourself, like, what does it look like to wholeheartedly believe that your story is one that God loves and God chose? And what does it look like to help others truly believe that as well, right? And I think when we do that, like that's the access point to creating a community that transforms every relationship and individual around us, right? It's not better programs and better songs and better preachers and better seats and TVs that are mounted here instead of there, right? It's people that believe God's work is so much bigger than any of us ever imagined it would be. And that's my hope. Like I often think, if you ever done Strength Finders, I'm futuristic, so I'm thinking like down the road a lot. And like I just have these amazing visions of a church that truly embraces that. In our lives individually, but in our community that I think is really bound up. That's like really hurting, that either doesn't believe that they have a seat at the table, or that maybe they thought the table ended with them. Like what does it look like to create those spaces for people? And so I hope you'll join me in that challenge to live that sort of life, to unwind individually and together as we embrace what God has for us. With that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I thank you that you do pursue us and that you do love us and that you wouldn't let anything distract or deter or get in the way from extending that love and that grace to us. Whether we're like the younger brother or the older brother, the promise of that story that we just dove into today is, God, that the same love and grace and story is equally extended to both of us. To all of us, wherever we are, God, you meet us. And I just ask that you would open our eyes and our hearts and our spirits to see that, believe that, and embrace that truth. And so be with us now as we continue to sing. God, prepare our hearts to receive communion. Praise all in Jesus' name. Amen.